Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this programmed event, which forms part of this year's MICAS International Art Weekend. My name is Edith Devaney. I'm a long-term curator and chair of the MICAS Creative Committee, and I'll be moderating this conversation and contributing a few questions myself. We are proposing that we speak for around about an hour and then take some time at the end for questions from the audience. So the focus of this year's program is a new sculptural work by the international artist Michele Oka Doner entitled The Palm Goddess from Malta, which was unveiled this week at a plinth in Piazza Teatro Reale, just a few yards from this venue. And if you haven't seen it, please find your way there. It looks absolutely amazing. Beautiful at night, beautiful during the day. And its presence in this very busy square in the middle of Valletta very much builds on the wonderful conversations around the impact of public sculpture, which formed the theme of the MICAS Education Conference, which took place here in Valletta a few weeks ago. And I'm sure we'll revisit many of the themes again in this morning's conversation. So for this morning's discussion, we are delighted and very honored to have the artist Michele Oka Doner with us to discuss her new work, where it sits within her overall oeuvre and her practice as an artist. Just to give you some background about Michele, she's an internationally renowned artist. Her career spans 6 decades. Her subject matter is very much underpinned by lifelong study and appreciation of the natural world and history and tradition, and from these she derives much of her formal vocabulary. The breadth of her artistic production encompasses sculpture, drawing, public art, functional objects, video, artist books, costume, set design. And she writes beautifully. And she's very celebrated for her permanent art installations throughout the United States. She's done some remarkable works, including Flight at Reagan International Airport, Radiant Sight at Herald Square in New York, and a 1.25 mile bronze and terrazzo concourse, the extraordinary A Walk at the Beach at Miami International Airport. And it very much, that particular work very much evokes her interest in the natural environment, and it's been seen by, I think, it's 40 million travelers annually, which is just kind of astonishing, the power of art. Her work is found in many public collections, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Whitney Museum, and Metropolitan Museum, also both in New York, the Art Institute in Chicago, and many, many more. She's received numerous awards. She was the first artist in residence at New York's Botanical Garden, and she's written many books as well. Born and raised in Miami, she now works and lives and works in New York. She was appointed guardian to the City of Miami, to the City of Miami's Beach Centennial Bayen tree, which I'm sure we'll talk more about during the conversation. And she represents Miami Beach as Ambassador for Arts and Culture. Given Michele's very deep immersion in ancient history and her engagement with Maltese history, which can be seen in the work, we thought it would be particularly fascinating to invite Professor Anthony Bonanno to contribute to this conversation, given his expertise in this area. Dr. Bonanno is Professor of Archaeology at the University of Malta within the Department of Classics and Archaeology. He has lectured in archaeology and classics since 1971 and has also worked and lecturing across Europe. He convened 3 international conferences and also authored numerous publications on Maltese archaeology with a special interest in prehistoric and Roman art. We're very pleased to have you with us as well. So I'm sure we want to get started. We want to hear what Michele and what Anthony have to say about this particular work. And I wanted to start about this sense of place. We've mentioned your interest in Maltese history and your knowledge, your deep knowledge in Maltese history. And it's that notion of, how does an artist effectively evoke that sense of place in a work? And I know this is something you've thought about a lot, Michele, and I'd love you to maybe just kind of touch on that with particular reference to this new work.
It's a notion that has always applied to French wine, the idea of terroir. And every place has its unique DNA that you can taste and you can hear, whether it's the wind going through the Roman pines, whether it's the water that's used in the flour and that make the croissants. So here, besides the wonderful food, it has a wonderful sense. With the wind blowing yesterday, I really felt it, of the world being blown through from everywhere, from Africa, from Europe, from just, you have a wonderful feeling of this island receiving the seeds that came in the air and on the shore. So the terroir here is a really fertile stew, to be returning to the metaphor of what makes a place special. We've always, until the industrialization of food, back to that is a good metaphor we can all understand, and art is more arguable, but food is more visceral, I think. We all understand the idea that certain places evoke certain tastes. So Malta, of course, I arrived, I opened my eyes and I opened my mouth.
And I mean, just kind of moving on from that, to what extent in a work like this, and given the whole kind of intention behind the work was to place it here in Malta and connect it, to what extent has an artist got a responsibility to engage in that way that you're describing, to kind of absorb that sense of history and ecology and somehow feed that within their own language and their own framework into their work?
I think that's something that intention should be fully present. And that is the engagement, really. I wasn't brought here to celebrate Miami Beach, where I was born. I was engaged to respond to the beauty and the feeling of this extraordinary and magical island. And there were parts of it that reminded me of quote unquote home, and those were of course the beautiful Phoenix palms, which you can see composed most of the body of the figure. And yet, of course, there's always the transcendent. Solzhenitsyn writes in his wonderful book, The First Circle, the first circle would be here, right where we're sitting, Valletta, this island and its geography, its place. And the second circle would be all of the people who came through. And the third is the one that I think artists really like to dance in, which is the transcendent, what I call the cosmic circle. And that's when you lift off, you're no longer, the piece belongs in Malta, made from the same ideas, but at some point it enters the larger conversation, that third circle, which is critical to any work of art.
No, it's fascinating. And one of the things we're kind of talking about here slightly obliquely is the idea that this work was not exactly a commission, but it was made specifically to be placed in this city. And that obviously has very much informed how you have gone about developing it, in the same way that you have with many of those very large site-specific works that you've done in America. And I wanted to kind of bring in Anthony here and ask about classical sculpture and how this argument about it being attached to the building that it was purposed for, and when you separate it, is how does that relationship with its culture change?
First of all, thank you. I must thank MICAS for this invitation, which was very unexpected. I'm very honored to be invited to even say a word or two, or to share my thoughts on this occasion, which is intended to celebrate the setting up of this beautiful monument by a well-acknowledged artist. And therefore, thank you very much for everyone for this invitation. To come to your question, we've had a word before over the internet before this session with Edith, and I did explain my background. I am, in fact, the first teacher of archaeology in Malta. A British professor had been appointed professor in 1939 for a few months, but the war took over and he didn't do any teaching, certain John Ward Perkins. So I can claim that, in fact, I consider it my greatest achievement to have started producing archaeologists, which are, some people might say we are overproducing them, but on the contrary, there is a lack of qualified archaeologists to be able to deal with the monitoring of the development that is taking place. My background started as a classicist. I first graduated in Malta in classical languages, Greek and Roman, ancient Greek and Roman languages and literature. But at that time, should I say 1971, I saw the writing on the wall that classics was not, or especially Latin, was not to last very long. It is not to remain on the same level as before. And I realized also the gap, the lacuna that we had in our education system of archaeology. We are, as you now realize, a country that is replete with archaeological remains, with archaeological heritage, and it didn't stand well not to have the teaching of the subject of archaeology at the university. I first moved from classics to classical archaeology. In fact, I studied classical archaeology in University of Palermo, and for my dissertation, doctoral dissertation, I actually chose as an art subject, classical sculpture. That is the compilation of a catalogue of Greco-Roman sculpture in Malta. After that, my qualifications were not enough for the university, and I was asked to do a further degree, and I followed a PhD in London. But again, I did focus on Roman art, on Roman portraiture, in sculptural portraiture, with a particular reference to portraiture in relief, commemorative relief. But in any case, just to explain that my interest was deeply set in sculpture and in art. Of course, I've had to do with real, down-to-earth archaeology, with objects, but I always kept my interests in classical art. And I returned to Malta and started teaching and I introduced the archaeology as a teaching subject. I realized, of course, that we had such a rich prehistoric heritage that it could not be ignored. So privately, I started preparing lectures in that field, as well as conducting research. And one of the subjects in my career of archaeology in the artistic aspect was always the role of the artist in the respective society. We know, for example, that going back only to ancient historical civilizations, we start with the Egyptian civilization. The artist in Egyptian civilization was anonymous, completely anonymous. We don't know of a single artist, especially by name. And little effort, in my view, has been made to even identify what we call artistic personalities in Egyptian art.
It wasn't important to the civilization at the time to identify artists.
I'm sorry?
I mean, the inference is that it wasn't important to the civilization at that time to celebrate the individual artist. It was because that's something that you and I have spoken about, isn't it? About, you know, identifying artists, and you made a very interesting comment, Michele, about whether they were copying something or whether they were creating something new. That the point at which artists were actually kind of using their own creativity, that was the point at which they were kind of individually celebrated. Which you know, please talk a little bit more on that.
Which is very recent in human history. You know, the Romans copied the Greeks. It wasn't about originality, it was about skill.
Exactly.
And so that was, you were part of a guild, you know, you were skilled. It was always about skill. The cult of the artist really started as a marketing tool. And that is something, I love the embarrassment of riches, the Simon Schama, you know, where all of a sudden you had a population of the bourgeois, you know, the people who owned boats could now be like the Medicis. They could paint their walls, you know, nobody had an image. Nobody, until the lithographic press, nobody saw images. You'd go into until maybe 300 years ago. It's so recent in our history, this idea of the artist, that you would see maybe a piece of palm bent and put behind the stove. That might be the only symbol, the only thing you would see that was visual. We don't realize how, because we're in a glut right now of overstimulation of visual images, that the ideas that we think about artists are really manufactured. And the best works of art are still, you ask the Japanese, you know, objects born, not made, you know, Anonymous, the unknown craftsman, which is the great Sotsi Yanagi, their greatest and first art historian, so to speak. So it's a very Western idea, and it has a lot to do with commerce.
Yes, and I think that, you know, when we reflect on those works of art or pieces of craft that really speak to us, it's how they interpret humanity, and it's how they interpret humanity not just for our time now, but across the centuries. And we know that there's still works of art that have got such great resonance for us, you know, be they from the classical period or like Michele's work here. It's kind of informing so much about how we think, and we're plugging into that artist's vision, which is I mean, for me, that's the very thing that kind of, you know, suggests that something is a very significant piece of art, whether it's labeled or not, but, you know, whether it's attributed or not.
Actually, the Japanese have no word for art, just like the Eskimos have 10 words for ice. So I was having dinner recently with a Japanese man who's an art dealer, and I asked him point blank, is it true the Japanese have no word for art? And he sat back, he had to think about it. He said, I guess we don't. We call it this or we say that. But that tells you it's a natural act. And if you look at the way they teach tea, which is their national ritual, you know, that starts, the book of tea begins, the bird flies over the pond and casts a shadow. The pond receives, giving and receiving, and are without intention. So just that wonderful sensibility. We are living in a celebrity-driven time, which, you know, you can go back to your wonderful Caravaggio in the museum and say this has been going on for, what, 200 years? But still, art here, the sculpture is back to beginnings, is at 5000 BC. So, what?
Just about. Yes,
just about. So, you know, well, let's talk about the other 99%, 99.5% of the creation. So it doesn't matter when someone walks through the airport, they have to, the signs are tiny. The graphic designer at Miami-Dade County should be removed. You know, he did these tiny little signs. And of course the contractor got a big plaque, but we won't talk about that. So, but does it matter? No. Am I happy? Yes, people need to. It's not that. Or as Wallace Stevens, a great American poet, says, it is not this then that makes us happy or unhappy. The bird sings, its feathers shine. And the next line is actually very Maltese. The palm stands at the end of space, which is true when you walk around the island.
Well, I found your reference to the lack of a word for art in Japanese civilization. It's almost equally odd that even the Greek civilization, the Greeks referred to art as techne,
yes,
a craft practically. But on the other hand, they went out of their way, the Greek writers, to actually identify artists. We know of scores of names of Greek artists with their work, you know, like the Aphrodite, Anadyomene, the Aphrodite, which by the way is the first nude statue, female statue in the Greek civilization, 4th century BC. But the Greeks did elevate the personality of the artist and put it on a pedestal. The opposite was what I was saying about Egyptian art, anonymous, and followed by the Romans, who, as you correctly said, were more concerned to copying, to have reproductions of these masterworks of the Greeks in their possession. And therefore, the artist in Roman art is simply a slave, practically, a servant, without any name.
No, it's kind of fascinating. That whole thing about the creativity and it being recognized from very early civilization is fascinating. And I want to come back, because Michele mentioned it again, the wonderful work she did in Miami Airport. But it brings me back to that sense of home. And Michele, you and I have spoken about how the place where you're born, you can never escape the resonance of that within your creative life. And I don't think any of us really can. And I wondered how you felt that was expressed in your work. I mean, for something like the piece we just unveiled here, you've looked at Maltese society, you've done fantastic research on history, but is there a little bit of Miami in there too? I mean, does that somehow carry through?
Well, of course, but I would say that's the cosmic level. You know, that's the transcendent part. But the first circle was really my visceral archaeological dig here, you know. I mentioned yesterday, I found a book in London in 1980 that was open to a page in a window in one of those old wonderful bookstores, and there were these shapes, these curves. It was the temples from Gozo. And so I went in and I didn't, you know, in those days, there was no UPS, no FedEx, and actually I didn't have a lot of traveler's checks either. There was no plastic money. So it took practically all my money to buy this book, but I fell in love. I didn't know what I was looking at. So how strange and wonderful, how cosmic even, that I'm here today. And there was a connection, which of course happened because Francis Sultana had seen a publication of my home in New York. And when he was a boy, he said, in Gozo, he said he was 14 and he saw this book on lofts. So someone brought him to the loft. It's a wonderful O. Henry story, kind of. It's a great story. But You know, as you were speaking and I was responding to your question, I also thought that the beauty of the education I had was we were required to study art history. Not any longer. And it's really fascinating without the understanding, the underpinnings of all of the extraordinary layers of civilization I'm standing on it, you know, and I only appear to be sitting. I'm standing on those. How else would all of this have happened? And yet it's not paid attention to any longer because we're moving so quickly, we don't have time to look back. We're just rushing over to the next, whatever there is, the next button to push.
But not only are you standing on it, you as an artist are part of that trajectory. And when Anthony and I had a Zoom call talking in preparation for this conversation, we were musing about the history of art, the literal history of art from beginning to end, and that slightly confusing situation that we've got into this habit of defining things in categories and in periods of time so that it becomes linear. And art isn't linear. The history of art isn't linear. And when we talk about very primitive art, which is a terrible word to use, but we all know what it means, and we're talking about things like cave paintings, they're not primitive, they're very sophisticated. And yet there's things that have been done 10 years ago that we would are actually better classified as more primitive craft-based art. But it's a kind of cyclical thing. Would you agree with that, Michele? That
it's absolutely true. Now, if you happen to enjoy Primitivo, which I do, it's not a bad word, you know. Or I buy a Zinfandel, which is a California version of Primitivo, and it says Old Vine on the label. Now, I know that I just enjoy the label. It's an ancient, I did not know this until that, this man who wrote Thomas, what's his name, Hoff something, Gödel Escher Bach. Remember that book came out? He wrote a book on how there's a feedback cycle, and it was extraordinary. And one of the things he showed was these three crows or ravens. They were corvids. And it's an ancient Celtic symbol, which is the label of the Zinfandel. And I know, I don't care what it tastes like. I just love, it says Old Vine, and there are those three birds, ancient birds circling. Now why? You know, what is that? That is because all of us, if we're open to it, we're all archaeological digs, you know, we're all
curious of our past, reconstruct our...
But connected to it, whether we're conscious of it or not, there is that connection. There's those threads that pull us back towards it at times. I mean, you must feel that very strongly in your profession.
You mean the search for our origins?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, that's the main purpose of the science of archaeology, the discipline of archaeology. And this is where I wanted to specify that I'm not an art critic, so I cannot speak, I cannot judge and critique works of art. I don't feel competent, whereas art has been my preferred sideline of the search for the history, for the story of humanity. And a reference was made to cave art. It's amazing how this art appeared suddenly without any antecedents. No one has actually identified the pre-cave art, which led to the cave art. And then it ended also without any offspring. we don't know the sequence. All of a sudden, the Paleolithic, the phase when people were nomads and hunters ended, and agriculture was invented in various phases around the world, mainly in the Eastern Mediterranean, and then spread. There is absolutely no link between the two. So, you know, there is a Latin saying, I don't have to repeat it, that cave art came into being without a mother and left us without an offspring. You know.
That's wonderful.
Well, I think it had a father, though. You know, Barnett Newman, in this wonderful essay in this magazine in the 40s or 50s, Tiger's Eye, he said the first man was an artist. He took a stick and he made lines in the sand. So what happened before the cave washed away? The sand on the beach, the mud castle. So there were, it's just they weren't permanent until clay, that mud they played with one night by the campfire, fell into the fire, and the next morning they realized, look what happened. Then we had the marker. It doesn't mean that they hadn't been doing it, and recognizing what their fingers were able to do. And how about taking the wattle, the reeds, and to take the extra when they're Neolithic and they could settle, and they had for the first time the grains. So they filled it with mud, they let it dry in the sun, and then a fire got it. The moments, those aha moments, they're not visible. And what we have to stop doing, he also made this great point. He said what's happened now is the scientific notions have taken over magic and mystery and wonder. You can't prove that there was what I just said, the story. There's no proof. So what? And
no, it's really a fascinating subject, and it's that whole idea about permanence and whether our forefathers, when they were painting in the sand, or the equivalent of Barnett Newman doing a zip in the sand and then the sea washing it away the next day, whether it still gave them a pleasure to do it. It must have done, otherwise they wouldn't have done it. Yeah. But I kind of think about, particularly public sculpture, is that sense of the monumentality of it. And this gets us onto a whole other area. Whereas, you know, working in the past, as I have, having experience of working with female sculptors, I know that a lot of them have had to face this challenge of the dominance, the male dominance, well, not just within all art, but sculpture as well. And just thinking of those significant sculptors of the last century who all worked in very heavy materials. They worked on a very big scale. I think all of them would imagine their work lasting as long as the Roman or Maltese historical work that you deal with. But as a female artist who grew up at the kind of, you know, you were being educated in art towards the end of that period, how did you navigate your way through that?
You know, when I was studying the Jansen art history book, which was the classic art history 101, someone pointed out years later, there's an art historian that I knew, that she was hired to write some women into it, but I never noticed gender, that there weren't women. I was just looking at the Egyptian, at the civilization. So I knew that today, you know, like many things, you know, the law schools, the medical schools, you would assume your professors were male. You lived within a world that was a certain way. But I always was interested in other things. I had what I now understand they call aggressive curiosity. And that's what was interesting to me. You know, I could sit, there was no television when I was a child. It didn't come till I was 7, and we weren't allowed to turn it on. So you had the day to watch the caterpillar go across the sidewalk and up the tree, you know, and see it on a weekly basis destroying your landscape, you know, and chewing, and ants. And so there's the answer. The answer is I've never looked to see what other people were making. I was very engaged in understanding how the world worked, and the smell of fire, which then came from the Everglades, because they used to let it burn till they stopped it. Now they know not to stop it. They know natural burning, which is coming from a place in Central Florida, the understanding. They burn it. And what you said about different categories, you know, it's a river. They know now you put a dam there, the salmon can't come back up to mate and to lay their eggs. So we are deconstructing a lot of things that should go back 5,000 years to what the temples here tell me and teach me, you know, what I've learned from being here. And again, things have to be taken down and away, not knocked down, not told to go away. It's a very simple act of letting them, of not restoring them. How's that? And so the aggressive curiosity, the aggression stays with the curiosity.
And doesn't stray beyond that. So it's a positive force. It's a positive energy.
Yes,
yeah,
it's a life force.
Yeah.
That's what the life force is.
Yeah. And the whole notion of kind of, you know, the femininity of your work, the acceptance that you're a female sculptor, you're not going to challenge what other people are doing, you're not interested in that, you're following your own course. It's very much shown in this new work, and the title suggests, you know, it's a goddess. And there's references to Venus de Milo, and you know, it resonates with Botticelli's Venus, and you know, it's that's all embedded in it, and it is such a celebration of the feminine, and I know that's something that is an important thread that runs through everything you do. And I wondered to what extent you fuse that with your interest in history and the natural world.
It's all really, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's all part of the same thing. I wouldn't be an artist if I would be a Roman, actually, if I was looking at, let's say, you know, a big welded piece and deciding, well, I better do that because that's what they want. Then you give away you give away it all, you know, you give your soul away, and you give the opportunity to understand what your real job description is as an artist, which is the marker of collective hopes and dreams. That's what we saw in the cave. They were all about the hunt they wanted, the animals, the flock they were hoping would come.
Sympathetic magic, yeah.
Sympathetic magic.
Good.
That is really great.
Yeah.
And that's an extraordinary thing. So I never overthought these issues. I knew they were there, and when I was in graduate school, and turns out I was the second MFA in graduate school in the 60s. The first happened to be the wife of a professor. So as I thought I knew that they didn't let women in, but I thought I would just ask. And I went up the steps of the graduate school, and they said, well, you know, but you cannot ask anybody to carry the men to carry heavy things for you. And I think I said, I won't do that. And so I got in. But it was a special time, and the men did say to me, come on, Michele, get with the program. they liked me, but I wasn't painting stripes, I wasn't painting targets, I wasn't welding I-beams. I was making these strange ceramic pieces that came from my own childhood of working in sand, embellishing the sand things with shells, running over to the water, picking up these golden fronds of Sargassum Sea, shaking them into the ponds I built. I was very busy. And I got to college and I saw the shop and all these guys. So the wonderful denouement was many years later, the head of the shop turned out to be a dean of a college, came to visit me after, he heard me speak somewhere, and then after 50 years, and he said, "How did you survive us? We were so brutal to you." And he gave the answer before I could respond. He said, "But we were brutal to each other as well."
And you saw that at the time?
Of course, you know, this is life. Nobody gives you a license or a ticket. And the great Norse myths say you have to steal the key. And usually, where is that key? According to Robert Bly, a wonderful poet, the key in his translation is under the mother's pillow. Now, what does that tell you about gender relationships in the 21st century?
It's very good. So just kind of keeping on with the whole sense of the feminine in art and expressions of feminism, I wanted to make reference, because I know you know these figures. It's what's referred to, and this is a horrible term, and you've said it too, is the fat figures of Malta. And this sense of, you know, what is their sexuality and does it matter? And were they things that you, Michele, when you came across them, how did they fascinate you? And as an artist, how did you interpret them? And against what, you know, how Anthony sees them as a historian. I'm kind of fascinated by that. Should we start, Michele, with you, just giving your reaction to those wonderful figures?
Well, you know, the beautiful Venus of Malta, it's undeniable that there's the capacity to look at a woman and look at a female and make a response. The same with the sleeping lady, they call her. But also I have a wonderful book with all the little heads on the heritage of, you know, I think it's published here. And it says that most of these objects are distinctively female. They have vaginas, but they don't have breasts, which is...
Not even vaginas, no sex, no gender.
The big sculptures
the big
in
ones,
stone, but the objects, yes.
Yeah, you actually pointed out the two exceptions. One, the Venus of Malta, which is clearly very naturalistic and female, of course, and the Sleeping Lady. All the others, or almost all the others, are practically asexual or without any gender, which is what they're supposed to be if they represent a religious concept. We especially in the Judeo-Christian religion civilization, we conceive of God, the major God, and even in the old classical times, a male protagonist of the Olympian god, of the Olympian group of gods, namely Zeus and Jupiter and Roman. But we make a mistake. I mean, in Judeo-Christian religion, we conceive of God as a bearded old father and so on, whereas any divinity should be completely without gender, without sex.
That's so generous of you. I'm so happy to hear you say we made a mistake. We made a big mistake, and it's really continues to inform. How nice. I like you so much.
You do.
Are you joining us for lunch?
Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's thrown me off my.
The book that I have, the writer David, what's his name?
David Trump, perhaps?
Yes.
You should remember Trump.
Yes, right. David Trump.
But it's a different Trump, of course.
No, I don't get stuck on negative energy, you know. He comments, and I'm trying to read, I think it's his reading, and I didn't bring that book with me, that still the majority have, and I've seen the relics, he has pages and pages of clay relics that have vaginas, without a doubt. It's a book downstairs. I might have bought the last one. They might have put them out of print with that. But so then I wonder why they say that it's asexual. What are asexual are the large stone ones.
Yes.
But in in Africa, it's a sign of abundance that women.
Yeah, I accept that.
And it's a sign of abundance in
Prosperity.
Central Europe. So why here is there what I'll call a reluctance to say that it was the divine feminine before we had the bearded old man?
I always try to promote independent judgment, independent search, and independent conclusion. I think that people should not, especially students, should not accept a fixed idea and continue to promote that idea. So I think we ought to look for alternative solutions, alternative interpretations, especially because in one particular class of these prehistoric representations, the Maltese prehistoric representations, there is absolutely no reference to gender, no reference to sex, neither the breasts, not even the genitals. Males are, they are neutral, they could be androgynous even, these figures. Whereas the male sexuality in our prehistoric neolithic is rendered by phallic symbols, independent phalli or phalluses, if you like, even in niches, sometimes double, sometimes triple. But there is absolutely no statue that could indicate to you exactly that it is a male figure. There are some, as you pointed out, that are clearly female, especially two, which you might have been referring to them, two figures, one found in Nidra and the other at Tarshian, showing very naturalistic, realistic, naked females, but they were already identified by our foremost archaeologist, Temiz Amit, in the between 1900 and 1935, as pathological. In fact, they have large stomach and protruding breasts, and even the spine is also distorted. So I think I would prefer to read in those two particular clay statues, pathological, like votive objects that are normally presented even in sanctuaries, even nowadays, in Thanksgiving for a cure from a particular pathological disease. So, you know.
Well, I think there were three, according to David Trump, the three phallic pieces, but the majority of relics were female. That's what this historian has said. So what I think that, if I had to scratch an itch, it's the reluctance to say that this might have been a culture, it seems to have been, with so many, page after page of a clay shard in a triangular shape, which he says are vaginas. So why then now the big stone pieces, of which there are fewer, were just deities. But the objects, the relics, I'll call them, were female. But given the fact that we have had this misinformation or false news, you know, that fake news that we call it today, that you know, and it's in the catalog. I was joking, with Phyllis when we did a Zoom during the COVID period, I had put a post-it up in the first catalog. It said, mankind in the essay, comma, the species from whom women were extracted. And I'm thinking, excuse me? So I took a yellow post-it, I put no, exclamation mark, but I waited till we went a little further in our relationship, and then I politely asked her on a Zoom if, when they did my catalog, if they could include a fact checker. So she goes, what? So I showed her this statement, because I can't understand, getting back to the reluctance, okay, the feeling we shouldn't say this when we have said something else. So we're coming up against something here that's strong in Malta and in lots of places with the Judeo-Christian sense, is that would this deity have made 2 elephants, 2 giraffes, 2 camels, and then Adam? No, you know, today they know, and it's taught in high school in New York, where my son went. They spend their senior year studying the St. James Bible. And in that Bible, they've teased out 5 voices. And then we have Harold Bloom, who taught at Yale, who wrote the Book of J, saying that one of the 5 was in the court of King Solomon. She was an aristocratic woman. So it is advanced to the point where it's been written and rewritten. And I have actually half a dozen books on the subject, which I love to pick up and go into any chapter. I find it so fascinating that how it played. It played because we went from symbol, from hieroglyphics, from, you know, the Egyptian way, the cuneiform. All people had access, like the airport floor. You can be that little boy who sat here, you could be anybody, and you don't need to be an art critic. The point is to make work that's accessible. Where did it go from access for people to leaving behind a population that had needed a license called being a male to read what the priests wrote? Well, it's a famous thing, reduction, reduction, reduction. The symbols became quicker, the scribes took over. Before we knew it, there was the first rewrite. And the rewrite had not Adam and Eve, but it had Adam, then Eve, then animals, then plants. That's where the vertical structure came. And that's what's been 3,000 years. I'm happy to send you a syllabus on this.
But I think it's fascinating, actually, because you've both said the same thing from very different positions. And this idea of history and art history and looking back at civilizations is something that should be malleable. And each generation needs to go back and re-examine former positions. And history is, I mean, again, like art history, we see history as linear, and of course time is linear. But we do re-examine it, and we do look again at all of those things because our interpretation of them is different. And that's a kind of fascinating thing about, you know, our relationship to classical art is forever shifting. You know, our time now will not see it in the same way as 100 years ago, and 100 years forward it will be different still. And of course, one of the things we don't know about all of those artists who made work and the people that made the fat figures here in Malta is the environment in which they work. And one of the things I wanted to end on, because slightly running out of time, is just to make reference to your working practice, Michele, and the fact that you're there in New York. You've talked about your loft. I've been lucky enough to visit you there, and it is extraordinary because there is this complete seamlessness between your life, the way you live your life, how you entertain your friends, your work, your fascination with history, your fascination with literature. It's all come together, and that's unusual. I mean, in my experience, visiting artists who have a separate studio, that's not always the case. Conrad's here; he actually lives and works in the same way. But it's that's so much part of your practice, and I just wanted you to talk a bit about that, and also to just mention the production of this particular piece.
Okay. First, I'll address living a full life was really, in a strange way, a prohibition of the art world. It was taboo. You had to, it was a formula, and it was club membership. And since I wasn't going to be in the club, it gave me such a license to have a really good time, because I think they were not having as good a time in their own way, because they were looking right and left and measuring all the time. So it's normal to live like that. That's how artists live. People didn't go, you would mom and pop stores, So it was also, I had married, which was also not a good thing to do in the art world. And then I had children, which was worse. And I was actually told not to tell anybody. But I brought my first child in a basket to an art opening. I had a really nice basket, and I didn't like those strappy carriers, and so that's a long time ago. So it all is of a piece, because I never fought it. I just kept building a life that was suitable for myself. That's pretty simple. And again, it has to do with not giving away your power. If you're constantly trying to be what you're not, to please, you'd end up with a very empty basket.
Yeah,
actually.
you're relinquishing a lot.
You relinquish who you are, So that's one thing. And then the process of making this piece. So I've really not made anything like it except one piece years ago, tentatively, which I never could explore fully, called Guardian. It was a guardian image. I loved it because it was winged, and I do love birds. I've always loved birds. And things that fly, I guess it's that lift, that sense of transcendence. And I had a family of mockingbirds that took up built the nest. They took up housekeeping under my bedroom window as a child. They both amused me and terrified me. So I developed an idea that I had 20 years ago into something so the seed came from my own vocabulary and interest, but then responded to this place and the people here and what they were going to see and live with. What was the palette? Certainly I didn't want to come in with welded steel spray painted red. This is not correct. And what's amusing to me is the idea of a piece being identified as, oh, that's a that, or that's a that. I think that's been an extraordinary disconnect from the goals and the aspirations of a profession that started here in many ways, was developed here, which is, I can recognize. So that my process was married to the beginnings here, and then who are these people who I was meeting? What is the life like here? I was fortunate to have 2 wonderful visits and be entertained in people's homes and listen to an evening one night on the language and whether it should be retained or whether there are too few speakers. There was an intimacy that was established with Maltese that I cherish, and probably could not have made a piece that had this much of that life in it without the generosity of the Maltese people I met.
Which is the reason that it's got such resonance here, and all of those things that you described, the personal experience, the experience that you had here, your acknowledgement of history, all of that is kind of inextricably bound up in one work, which makes it kind of wonderfully unique. I mean, that's the wonder of art, I guess. But I just wanted to also ask you about the process of manufacture. Oh. And what's always fascinated me about sculptors as opposed to people who just paint, all of that is done on your own, by yourself. You have to work with people who collaborate with you. And I know that there's some sculptors that will make the mold and send it off to the factory and wait for it to be returned. You're much more hands-on. You're kind of like the midwife there, just seeing the whole process through.
Well, I didn't really know how it was going to work, so I had to be there. You can't delegate what you can't say or draw. It evolved, that piece. It grew. You can see that. You know, where you can see it is midway. The base, I was separate, and there's actually a photograph in this that shows that I don't know how they got it. They must have clipped it out of a video. It was in the program last night where they were actually lowering the top on the bottom, and I'm standing there thinking, is this going to work? So, but that's what makes it exciting. When you don't know what you're really, you don't know, that is the truth. That's the magic. It works for me too. I didn't know when they unveiled the airport, you know, whether it would work. I didn't, you know, you don't know. It's a risk. Because, and it should be, you should be hanging out there with one toe left in the building. And that's when something really has the transference of my energy, my physical, you know, the physicality, the intellectual capital I inherited from people like the professor here. I had such wonderful professors. I'm always so happy to meet a professor. You know, it's such a gift they give us as students. And I stayed in touch with 2 out of the 3 noble warriors who taught me. And one was Oleg Grabar, the great Islamic scholar, who I really learned about pattern and distribution. And again, he was an archaeologist. He excavated the bathhouses in Syria near the Iraq border. And the other was also an archaeologist, Dr. Walter Spink, who was the one who worked in the Ajanta caves and always said to me, Michele, there's a stone bed there waiting for you. So I stayed in a hotel. But even when they were both very old men in their 80s, I found them. It's a gift that you give, and your work.
Part of the fun.
It is part of the fun, yes.
Yeah,
so it's part of the process.
Yeah, of course. Good, thank you both. Now I think we're going to go for ask the audience if they've got any questions, and there are people with mics, is that right? Yes, I see the mics at the back. So if anyone's got any questions, please raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone to you. And here.
I thank you very much. I loved hearing you talk there, all of you. It was really fascinating. I wondered something that I think about a lot in terms of archaeology and the past is the sort of perhaps the omission or the forget or about the role of humor in the past. So I think there's always often a sort of maybe we forget that people 1,000 years ago or 2,000 or even 5,000 years ago had probably the same sense of humor or just as sophisticated sense of humor as we have now, and that's something that perhaps that we forget in the process of archaeology and the sort of, I think it's called post-processionalism, that you regard all the things you find as being left there for real reasons or for earnest reasons or for sort of sincere reasons, but actually that maybe people were playing jokes and playing pranks and thinking, I'm going to put this weird thing in this tomb because in 1,000 years' time someone's going to find it and they're never going to work out why I put it here. And I think that maybe we forget about humor in the part. It's very difficult to understand humor because there's so little, jokes are so verbal and storytelling was so verbal, but maybe you had something to talk about that in terms of history or the interpretation of the past.
That's a very good point. There's an image I have in a South African cave painting book of a man, a figure running because the bees are chasing him because he has the hive. And I just love that image, and you have to laugh when you see it.
Anthony, have you got any comments on, in your research, have you found any humor, or what you interpret as humor in
Humor
in the sculpture and the artifacts that you found?
There are various cartoons, but modern ones, especially of two future humans looking at a head, a skull of probably the man who's creating that cartoon. So we shall, some of us at least, will be the subject of archaeological research in the future. Otherwise, humor just of the cuff.
Something like the fat figures. I mean, I think, Conrad...
Oh, no humor there.
You think there's no humor there? But they are funny, aren't they? I think they're rather amusing.
Funny? I never thought of that.
Right.
But still, strange, intriguing, but certainly... No, I don't identify any. But
it is a very difficult thing to try and decipher, isn't it? Whether any humor was intended in works of the past.
There is some humor in late Greek sculpture, what we call Hellenistic humor, like representations of pygmies, grotesque figures, especially in the Nile. In the Egyptian area. But otherwise, the Romans were even less humoristic. They just wanted to be commemorated for self-esteem.
Yes, so that kind of gets into the whole sort of kind of monumental art. Good, thank you. Any other questions?
Firstly, I'd like to thank you for a very interesting discussion, very intimate discussion. You were speaking a lot about the Greek and Roman influence and how much you were inspired by lots of the artworks of the past. Well, to me, I don't know, maybe you had mentioned it, but it harks back to the Nike of Samothrace and with the feeling of liberation. I don't know whether it might have inspired you when you actually were thinking about the concept of creating this wonderful artwork.
I think so. I think it's all there. It's all swimming around, and certainly the Greek and the Roman sculptures are so still profound. We still hold them as such a there's such a high note. I think that I hear them so clearly. Yes, there are other things, but you're correct. And I've been looking at sculpture since I was a child, and we went to Europe, and when my parents was safe in the leave us in the Tuileries to walk around while they went into the museum. And it was just an amazing experience to see. And Miami Beach was wonderful, but we didn't have one art museum until recently. Not that you need an art museum today, but you also didn't have an internet. You didn't have, we did have National Geographic, I will say. That was a great influence too.
May I say something?
Yes, of course.
I take you at your word, use of the word liberation, really understand. Yeah, part of my fascination with art, ancient art, especially also prehistoric, Maltese prehistoric art, is the parallelism with Michelangelo's prisoners. We all know that Michelangelo, in fact, expressed the idea himself in his artistic practice in building up or carving sculpture. He felt liberating the figure out of the stone. And in fact, one of the slides shows one of Michelangelo's figures. We have a parallel in Malta. We have a set of figurines, 6 figurines carved in stone, found in the Brockdorf Circle, the Shara Circle, which was a cemetery, which I prefer to see as the work of the same artist in different stages of completion. And in the 3 most incomplete figures, you can see the figure coming out of the stone in the same way as Michelangelo was liberating his prisoners. We don't know what they were intended to represent. But still, I think we in Malta, I made this claim, I had to make up a lot of courage to say it, we have our prehistoric Michelangelo. Namely in this artist, because quite exceptionally, we have at least six pieces of sculpture that are attributable to the same person, to the same hand, to the same artist, in different stages of completion.
Which is it's very unusual. This is something that we talked about when we spoke last week, that it's very unusual to find something
the one
like
I'm referring
this.
to.
Exactly, yeah. And there is an image of that on the screen.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Sorry, let's yeah.
I found the question about the Nikeo Samothrace interesting because there's clearly a visual coincidence, if not actually a pun, between the palm fronds and wings of creatures that fly. So were you punning, basically? Were you kind of capitalizing on that visual coincidence consciously? And the second question pertains to the palm fronds. How did you do it technically? Did you you use regular palm fronds, or did you sculpt new fronds, or did you cast fronds? Or so one is the coincidence, and secondly, how did you?
Everything. I didn't.
I see. Translate the palm.
Palm fronds should only grow in the shapes that I want them to do, right? So what I did was I started with a lot of hot wax, and I started with a lot of leaves. But the problem with the fronds is if they're very dry, they get wiggly, so they don't dry straight, so you lose that energy. So you can't dry them. Then if you use them when they're fresh and you put the wax on them so they can burn out, you need 1/4 of an inch to burn, and those are not 1/4 of an inch. Then when they are unhappy under the wax, so they begin to contract and lose their moisture, the wax pops off. So you can't just copy them, you can't just embed them. So you have to play, you have to let them do what they want to do. You have to share with them. So I tear them into pieces, to strips, to lessen the problem of release of the moisture, and I start piecing it together like a Lego. How's that? It's palm Lego. The wings and the palms,
Yeah, the visual coincidence between the wing and that we all see there and the frond.
Well, if you look at the sky, you see both wings and palms. They're there. It's not a coincidence. It's a deep knowledge, ancestral knowledge, as Jung would say.
But you wanted to bring it out.
I wanted to play with it. There's the humor.
I see.
I wanted to dance on it.
It was already there then.
Yeah, that's what, these are very human, embedded, emotional evolution that has allowed us to be the people that we think we are or want to be. And it's all there. And it's just about understanding how to manage when and where to express all these things. So artists, I think, are basically generous people who want to share either the exuberance, the mystery, the hopes and dreams, or the trials or the trauma. We've gone through what I call the Freudian era of art, starting with Van Gogh's ears. But before that, we had, the narrative of the hunt, the narrative of the pagan goddess becoming the man, the Jesus. We've had so many ways of sharing through art. And I think that's the word. The last word here is they left something, the wonderful Maltese, the Michelangelo of Malta, the Venus of Malta, they left something for me to come along thousands of years later and gasp and be happy to see it and feel connected to it, a wonderful exhilaration. And isn't this what it's about?
Thank you, that's a wonderful answer. Any other questions? Yeah. A mic is just coming to you.
Thank you so much. It's all just so exciting. I have loved this whole 2 hours, and I have loved the work, and I loved the specific location of the work. And that, I think, is my question, in that I'm really interested in public space and how we share common space in Malta. And I'm wondering if you were briefed beyond that it was just going to go in Valletta, or because as I understand it, that's a temporary location where it is now, that it's actually going to be moved to the museum grounds in Floriana. So I suppose I'm thinking about the stunning juxtaposition, in my view, from those pictures with the pillars and the old ruins of the opera house. I noticed you've completely left out that cafe that spreads all across the street and completely obliterates the front of the ruins, so we can't read the history of that site, that particular site. But I suppose I'm wondering about to what extent you pictured this precise spot where the work was going to be shown.
There were several options that were in play while I worked, and all of them were wonderful. So the decision was made that was a more practical decision where it could be installed temporarily while the museum, the MICAS is being built. And I don't think it could go anywhere in some way, but it does look wonderful along the street. Then it becomes the guardian, also this fly likes me.
Yeah,
Okay, yes.
That's what on me.
Oh, good. I send it back to you. So, but that's really, that will evolve. That remains to be seen, where it lives.
But it is, you're right, it's a beautiful home for it. It's a perfect location.
A small remark from a layman, completely secular. Just now, I've seen it on the way here. It reminds me very much of the Nike or Victory of Samothrace
That's what they're saying.
on the Louvre,
Yes.
at the top of the staircase
Of course,
of the Louvre.
Yeah, absolutely.
I stopped there.
Yeah, no, you're quite right.
Which I saw when I was 7. Yes, I went up the stairs for the first
The fly's at me now, it's my turn.
So it's definitely in there.
One more question.
I was just thinking, is it on? Yes. You were speaking about Greek and Roman mythology, and we were about feminism and about the goddess, and in so many myths, a woman, a female girl, sometimes a woman, escapes rape or aggression or kidnapping. The gods transform her into a bird or a star or a tree, and this work seems to me to be, to have a great kinship with those myths of transformation in which a female being is both loses and gains some higher power in the course of the transformation. This figure, female figure, goddess figure, does seem to have a sisterly kinship with those transformed women. I wonder if that occurred to you when you were making her.
Probably. I've read so many wonderful stories. There's the Firebird. There's, which I prefer the Firebird to Swan Lake, in fact, But I hear you have prehistoric swans here that were discovered recently in a cave.
What was discovered?
Prehistoric swans.
Oh, a long time ago they did, yes.
Yes.
That's true. Of course, bones.
Bones.
Bone remains of a rather largish swan going back to, I would say, 180,000 years ago.
That's wonderful.
Before the presence of humans on Malta.
See, it's an ongoing thing.
At Ardalam, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we probably should draw it to a close now. So I just want to finish by thanking MICAS, thanking our chairman, Phyllis Muscat, for hosting this wonderful event and for installing and presenting this wonderful work by Michele in Valletta. And to thank our speakers, Dr. Bonanno, thank you so much for your contribution. And Michele, I mean, what a joy to hear you talking about your work and talking about your influences, and to use a word that you used when you were talking about Maltese art for sharing your artistic vision and sharing your wonderful art with us here. Thank you.
Thank you, Edith. You're so sweet. You really is such a sweet person.
And
professor.